Hello, I'm Jared Morris, and this is Settled Christianity, coming at you with my third installment in the Soteriology in a Flash series. And this week, we're going to be beginning on our two really interesting soteriologies, a type of soteriology that you may not have heard before. It goes by the name of Molinism. And this is super interesting, and I personally think it's interesting because even if you don't agree with Molinism, it brings in a concept that can be applied to a lot of different types of theology. Uh, there's a lot of people who hold to parts of Molinism without being a Molinist, and we're just going to jump in real quick. We're going to start as usual with the history of Molinism. So Molinism is named after Luis de Molina, who was a Jesuit theologian. Jesuit is a type of a Roman Catholic theologian from Spain. He lived from 1535 to 1600, and if you're keeping up with the time, that's right around the time where he could be really dealing with the reformers and the theology of the reformers, Martin Luther and Calvin, and the ideas of these big reforming people of the day. And he was really in his private study, he was really dealing with these theological questions that the reformers were bringing up. Particularly, he was curious about the tension between man's free will and God's sovereignty. And as we looked at in the last 2 weeks, this was a big question to the reformers. People like John Calvin and a little bit of Martin Luther held to a much more deterministic view of the world. Maybe not completely deterministic, but leaning that way. Whereas people like Arminius held to a much more free will based view of the world. And Molina, he comes along and he's trying to balance this. How do we get God's sovereignty and man's free will at the same time? And it was through this idea, through this struggle, that he develops the idea of middle knowledge. And you may not have heard of it, and it's a really interesting idea. So, middle knowledge is the concept that God knows contingent truths. So, what does that mean? That's kind of philosophical still. Basically, is that God not only knows what has happened, this is basically just knowledge of the past, and what is going to happen, which we refer to as his foreknowledge. God knows what would have happened if we were in a different situation. And I have a passage here. This is one of the clear passages on middle knowledge in the Bible. It's 1 Samuel 23:10 through 13. It says here, Then said David, O Lord God of Israel, thy servant has certainly heard that Saul seeketh to come to Keilah to destroy the city for my sake. Will the men of Keilah deliver me up into his hand? Will Saul come down as thy servant hath heard? O Lord God of Israel, I beseech thee, tell thy servant. And the Lord said, He will come down. Then said David, Will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, They will deliver thee up. Then David and his men, which were about 600, arose and departed out of Keilah. And we see middle knowledge here. This idea that David goes to the Lord and says, Lord, if I stay in this city, will Saul come down and attack me? And God says, yes. And he says, okay, Lord, if Saul comes down to attack me, will the men of the city betray me? And God says, yes. And so David leaves. And so this isn't foreknowledge because it doesn't happen. God wasn't seeing the future. God was seeing something that would have happened if the situation would have been different. And so in our life, middle knowledge is that God would have known if I chose not to do this video what I would have done. He knows what would have happened if I didn't get saved when I was a young child. He would have known all the contingent paths in my life. He would have known what each of those would have led. Now, Molinism is a step farther. So, middle knowledge can be held by a variety of people. I think middle knowledge is pretty clear in the Bible. There's a lot of Calvinists, a lot of Arminians who hold to middle knowledge. Molinism bases a soteriology around the idea of middle knowledge. So, Molinism is the idea that God has created situations where people would freely choose Him. So basically, if there's two paths for a person, this person goes to a baseball game and doesn't get saved and doesn't even think about God that day. And this path, he ends up running across a person with a track, and the track person with the track talks to him, and he ends up freely choosing to get saved. That God sovereignly sets up the situation where he directs him to that path. And so God is sovereign in that he sets up the situation, but man in the situation still has his free will to accept or deny. God just knows that he will accept it in this situation. And so Molina, by constructing this idea of middle knowledge and how God has directed mankind in this way of like trying to set up these sovereignly designed situations in order to um, get as many people to come in freely. Molina was really trying to balance everything, trying to explain God's sovereignty, man's free will, and looking at all these different concepts. Now, right away, if you're thinking about it, this might lead to some questions, and we're going to be looking at those in a few weeks. I think next week we're going to be doing our last system of soteriology, and then the week after that, we're going to be looking at some conclusions, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of all these different systems. But kind of as a final note on Molinism, I want to say that Molinism, one of the strongest points about it, is that it isn't that strict. You see, Molinism doesn't take a stance on predestination, eternal security, limited atonement, and all these other topics that we've been talking about. Molinism is just the general idea of this is how God gets people to salvation. Now, if you want to bring in the idea of limited atonement and apply it to Molinism, you can. There's some forms of Molinism that's far more Calvinistic. There's some that's far more Arminian. There's some that's very bizarre, honestly. There's some that takes some pretty interesting looks at human history and how God interacts with humans. And that's really Molinism's biggest strong point. There's some supporters that hold to eternal security, some that don't, some that hold to limited atonement, some that don't, some that hold to Calvinistic interpretations of predestination, and some that don't. And so that's really one of the best things about Molinism is how flexible it is to any belief, and that's why I believe that's why Molinism has made a real big comeback in recent years. Is because it is so flexible to any type of theology that you have. But anyways, with all that said, I hope you've learned something. Molinism is super cool, and I'm really looking forward to next week. And so, try to come back and let me know down in the comments what you thought about the video. If you've ever heard of Molinism, let me know what your take on it so far. And, if you've enjoyed the videos, please subscribe, like, come back for more, share the videos. It's always a help. And once again, be tuning in bi-weekly for my wife's wonderful videos that she's been putting on. Come back every Sunday for my videos. And I think all that being said, thank you for joining us. Once again, I'm Jared Morris. This has been Settled Christianity.